So I took it upon myself recently to look at the Goodreads rating of every single unread book on my shelves, and it kind of brought up an interesting idea for me. So in looking at all of the ratings, I saw that there was quite a difference between the top rated book and the lowest rated book. I do feel like I look at Goodreads' average rating of a book as kind of a metric of whether the general population likes a book, but I also feel like I have often felt like the rating isn't really fair or representative of what I experience in the book. So I'm not sure whether my reading taste is going to align with the ratings of these books, and I'm kind of curious to find out if Goodreads has merit in my reading life in terms of its average rating, or if my rating doesn't fit into the average whatsoever. So I did undertake the arduous process of looking up every single unread book on my shelves and finding what the average rating was of each of those books. However, I am not going to include any kind of anthologies or collections in this video, so no poetry collections, no short story collections, nothing like that. And I also have chosen not to use like nonfiction and memoir, so this is strictly novels, because I think when it comes to collections or when it comes to like nonfiction or memoirs, the rating system for me is a little bit different in that when I'm looking at a collection, it's a little bit hard to kind of average a rating even for myself. And so I just didn't want it to be super confusing. And I also feel like with memoirs, it's such a like personal thing that it's hard even to rate a memoir because that's like someone's personal life. So I'm just doing novels here because I thought that would be the easiest thing to tackle. But it did turn out that I think these were the highest and lowest rated books on my bookshelf at all. So I just wanted to explain caveat of what things I didn't include. But without further ado, let's talk about the two books I'm going to be reading in this video. The highest rated book on Goodreads on my unread bookshelf is Our Share of Night by Mariana Enriquez, and it has an average rating of 4.26. So this is a book that I've heard such amazing things about, and I love Mariana Enriquez, and maybe this isn't quite fair because it is going to skew positive, I think, for me in my reading because I already love Enriquez, but this literally was the highest rated book on my bookshelves, and I've heard that this is Enriquez's like magnum opus work, so very much looking forward to reading this, and I had already planned on reading this month, so it kind of worked out perfectly. And my lowest rated book with a rating of 2.72 is Aquarium by Yara Shahori. So the deficit between these two books is pretty big. I did have another book that came pretty close to being the worst rated book, but this one barely edged that out. And this is really interesting to me because I've had this book on my shelves for quite a while. I actually think I bought it when it first came out. But anyway, it's really interesting because I haven't really heard much at all about this book. It's a book that I just randomly came across, and it's translated and written by a woman, and it explores something to do with deaf culture. It's like two siblings and they are both deaf. And the combination of this being translated and talking about deaf characters really got me invested in reading it. And then I've just had it on my shelf for years and never picked it up. So this is a good push for me to do that. However, I'm just really not sure how I'm gonna feel about it. I think sometimes Goodreads reviews sort of skew my perspective going into a book. And if it's very highly reviewed on Goodreads, or if just someone tells me how great it is, I'm more likely to go in and have a positive interpretation of it. But that's not always true. And I do have high hopes for this despite the bad reviews. I just think that the topic and the theme sounds really interesting, but I'm not sure whether the writing style is gonna throw me off. That's the one thing I've heard. I'm trying to like not look at specific reviews before going into either of these so that I don't totally skew my perspective, but I've heard a little bit about the writing style of this being a bit more challenging, so I wonder if that's where some of the ratings are coming from. But that aside, I am still excited to read this and very excited to read Our Share of Night. So this is sort of going to be the comparison, the highest and lowest rated books on my bookshelf, and I'm gonna take it away into vlog style for the rest of this video, and I will update you when I have more to say. Okay, so I'm here for my first check-in about Aquarium. I did take the dust jacket off. I'm on page 44 right now, and I went ahead and actually broke this up into sections to read every day because I was finding that I was having a hard time getting started, and as I was trying to get through the book, I really didn't feel super motivated. So if that gives you any indication of how I feel about this book so far, I feel very torn because I really want to like this book. I love books about deaf characters. They're homeschooled, which is cool, and it's translated, so there are a lot of elements of this that I really want to love. I think I'm liking it more as I'm falling more into the writing style. The first little bit, I felt really confused and really lost. I noted down there are just some awkward sentence structures in this book. But let me just read you this passage. It's about how the sisters are in fact different. It says, "There were indeed differences in temperament, in the shape of the eyes, in the one body that began to lengthen while the other insisted on remaining small for its age, in an expression that was amused on one face, while on the other the joke might be a backdrop for tears." So reading it out loud, I guess it doesn't sound that bad. I think in my head, it just felt like a lot of pieces that were broken up by like 4 or 5 different colons and semicolons in the sentence. And I just thought that it sounded kind of odd. I do think that the writing does kind of suffer from that like clunky, translation-y kind of sound. So I don't know if that was like the #1 best example, but to me, it was just kind of a weird sentence structure. They're also really trying to hammer home this idea that people see the two girls as the same, but they're actually different. And they say it in myriad ways within the first 40 pages. It's kind of like a refrain that they keep coming back to, which is fine. I guess it just feels kind of repetitive to me. There also are a lot of mythological creature comparisons, comparing the girls to creatures. So it says, "The deaf sisters, nocturnal demons, mythological creatures who were doomed to make little noises and then sink to watery depths." So they're trying to make us feel creeped out by the two girls or make them seem otherworldly. And I do think that it's working in that way. I just don't know to what end. I think that there are going to be a couple of different structures throughout the book because we're kind of just in this chapter, like 1, 2, 3, 4 type of situation. And then later on we get one sister's perspective and then the other. And then in like the third part of the book, we get yet another structure where it's more just a vignette type of style. So there's a lot happening in this book in terms of stylistic elements. So far, there's also these sections that appear that are like bolded, and I think that they're talking about one of the sisters and a man that she's in a relationship with, and she's trying to like describe her childhood, which is interesting. I just think that it's a little bit hard to follow right now. I'm really trying to like take my time with it and comb through the references and like make notes because I feel like it is a little bit of a challenging read in the writing style and just in the amount of elements that are brought into it. It doesn't feel like a very plot-driven book. In fact, I really wasn't feeling like there was much plot to be had until they moved to a village, as they call it, because they had a kind of scary visit from the state who kind of came in and were determining whether the girls were safe and healthy and taken care of. I assume. I mean, they didn't really say exactly what the visit was about, but they did talk about how they got everything ready in the house to kind of make it look presentable, and the mom was going to like say that homeschooling was so great and these are the reasons and that that's the best thing for her children. And it's very clear that they were free-range children running around, not really doing any schoolwork, and she was basically going to be lying to the state. So that was like the most interesting plot point so far. I'm still trying to get invested in the characters and the story. I'm feeling, I don't know, like it's a little bit hard to work through. In terms of it being the lowest rated book on my TBR on Goodreads, so far I understand why people are turned off by this. I even feel like if I wasn't trying to make a video, I may not have continued to read it so far. Though I may not be giving it enough of a chance. I try to like give a book a little bit more of a chance to like turn around. But I do think that it is better now that I'm getting used to the writing style. So yeah, I understand why people probably didn't love it in terms of the beginning, but we'll see how it progresses as I continue reading. I'm gonna try to read another 50 pages today, and at the end of that, I will give you another update. Okay, so I am back to jump on and talk to you more about Aquarium. So here's the tea. Unfortunately, I DNF'd this. So this is kind of unfortunate given the fact that I wanted to have a full scoop to give you about whether this deserves the low rating that it got. But I suppose that DNFing it does kind of also illuminate why the star ratings are low for those of the people who push through. So I almost considered not continuing this video just because I felt really bad about not having the full story to tell you. But with the aim of trying to be authentic to myself and my reading tastes and not put myself into a slump, I decided to DNF this. So I got to page 80 and I really just felt like it was not improving from all the things that I said before. It was still feeling very difficult to understand and very disjointed. And for all the reasons I already said, I just could not push through it. It was putting me into a reading slump. I was actively not reading so that I could avoid this. And I didn't feel like I could pick up something else in between because I knew that I had to come back to this. So I felt like it was necessary to read this first, which was really not good for me. So that being said, I did DNF Aquarium, unfortunately. It's quite disappointing. But I have my phone here to read some Goodreads reviews and kind of see how I feel about them, if they are kind of on the same page as the things I was talking about. So I will say that this book only has 62 reviews and it has 244 ratings, which is considerably less than the vast majority of things on Goodreads. Obviously, this is more of an indie book, so I didn't expect that it would have tons of reviews. But I will admit that the sample size isn't huge for this. But that being said, it looks like the highest percentage is 2 stars with 33% of the ratings, 30% of the time 3 stars, and an equal number of 13% between 1 and 4 stars, with the 5-star being the smallest amount of ratings at 8%. So the breakdown here is, you know, mostly 2 and 3 stars. So I'm not going to go into every single review that I see or talk through like all of the high reviews specifically, but most of the high reviews, the few that I could find, are related to the beautiful writing and people really enjoying the writing style of it. And one person talks about liking the thematic elements. People call the writing poetic, and some people give that 5 stars because of it. One 5-star rating that I thought was interesting comes from Ted Patrick, and it says, "This is a hard book to start and then keep going. I wanted to quit after 30 pages, but I forged ahead, all the while getting more interested and absorbed into the world of these 2 sisters. The book is not much of a story, but more of a biography of a pair of sisters raised in the most troubling house. Since it is fiction, Shahori allows wonderful little sketches of the girls and the women they become to suffuse the book with both heartwarming and heart-rending insights into the fate of the misfits of our society." So this person who gave it 5 stars even admits that it is a hard book to get into and almost didn't forge ahead. So to me, that is really interesting that this person still gave the book 5 stars after saying that. It makes me wonder whether if I continued reading it, I would have felt differently about it. But again, for all the reasons I said before, I just couldn't finish it. But it was interesting to see a 5-star review that said that it was hard to get into. Another trend that I'm seeing in these Goodreads reviews are people being confused. For example, this review by Larissa May, who rated the book 2 stars, says, "I was genuinely so confused throughout the entire book. I'm not sure if it was lost in translation or if reading it at a busy coffee shop made it that much harder to understand. While reading, I struggled to create images of the characters in my head, and the timeline was not very clear. I think my least favorite part of it all was having no idea where the storyline was going and still having no clue where it ended up. I rated it a generous 2 stars, but I almost rated it 1 star." So this kind of sums up some of my feelings about this book for sure. The confusion, it's interesting to hear this person talk about how they did not get any clarity by the end of the book, so that also kind of makes me feel a little bit better about not finishing it because I don't know that I would have gotten like any any more clarity. And another trend that I'm seeing is people who say, I really wanted to love this book, the premise sounded so interesting, but it just didn't work for me. Like this review from Suzanne, who rated it 1 star, saying, I love the premise of this story, but I had a terrible time with this book. I found the writing too meandering, convoluted, and enigmatic. Much of the time I was guessing at what the author was trying to say, and I kept having to go back and reread to have even a slight chance of understanding the narrative. In this review from Inzi, who did not rate the book, they say, I wanted so badly to be enamored, head over heels in love with this book, but maybe it would have been better off as a bunch of short proses instead. And then finally, this review from Rob, who rated it 2 stars, says, literary fiction too often misses the mark in balancing prose with pacing, and I would certainly count this book as an example of that. Perhaps an issue with the translation, or perhaps a disconnect between my taste and a book that others would find very good. All I can say is that I had a difficult time forcing myself to be engaged with the story, even though I found the concept interesting. Not the worst book ever, but not one I would recommend. So I think that these reviews hit on a lot of the points that I had been talking about and feeling. The only other thing I want to mention is actually a very lengthy and really well done review by Lei Ann. And I'm not gonna read this whole review because it is quite lengthy, but this person rated the book 1 star and is a deaf reader reviewing books with deaf characters. And I wanted to mention this review because this reviewer talks a lot about the areas that this book does not provide a realistic lens through which to view deaf characters. The reviewer mentions a big problem being an inconsistency in identity and voice and how it relates to deaf representation. The reviewer does mention the fact that as far as the sensory orientations and experiences / culture of the deaf characters go, it's fairly accurate. However, they have a problem with the fact that Shihori mythologizes / metamorphizes deaf sense-making, basically saying that the deafness is either a superpower or an evil entity, and there's kind of this mythologizing of deafness rather than it just being a fact of these people's life and experiences. So I'm not necessarily doing this review justice. This reviewer really did an in-depth analysis of the representation of deaf characters in Aquarium, and I just wanted to bring that up because I think that it's an important aspect of this book. And there were passages that I was also kind of noting down to myself, wondering if anyone else would have talked about this, because I found it to be a bit strange. So it was helpful to read a review of that and to note that a deaf reader reviewing this book gave the book 1 star. So after reading some reviews, I do feel a little bit more justified in my review and my experience with this book. Obviously, I cannot provide a full review because I didn't finish it, but in the 80 pages or so that I read, I just really wasn't impressed, and I wanted to love it, just like many of the reviewers said. Desperately wanted to love this book because the premise sounded so great, but it just was not for me. So those are my thoughts on the lowest rated book. Now I want to turn our collective attention to Our Share of Night, which is the highest rated book on my bookshelves. And I am much more excited about this considering that this is one of my favorite authors. So I am going to jump into reading Our Share of Night, and I will update you as soon as I have some thoughts to share. Okay, so let's talk about Our Share of Night, the high-rated book for this video. I am currently 30 pages into this, so not very far yet, but it is feeling kind of dense and feeling like it's requiring some focus from me. So I'm kind of taking it slow and trying to really sit with it and let it soak in, because I love Enriquez so much and I want to fully understand this and not just throw on an audiobook in the background and not really pay attention. So I'm kind of doing a dual situation with the audiobook and the physical book, and reading both at the same time or switching off and making sure that I really get this because it feels like it's going to be a complex story. It is a very long book, and if you've been around this channel for any amount of time, you know that I have a bit of a big book fear. So the fact that this is almost 600 pages is a little bit intimidating, but her writing is so beautiful and so impactful, and there's this suspense that's building already. And I love the ways that we're getting these like little bits of information in a very natural seeming way rather than like a big info dump. So I really like the way that she's introducing us to the supernatural elements in the story. So yeah, so far so good. I can definitely see why this is a highly rated book. I'm not surprised considering that Enriquez is one of my favorite authors. So I'm just looking forward to continuing this at this point, and I will update you when I get a little bit further in it. All right, so I'm here for an update. I am on page 139. I am just about to start part 2. Part 1 was this whole thing, and then part 2 is only a couple of pages, and then immediately it starts part 3. So part 2 will be super fast. But my thoughts on part 1. I found it slow to start, and it required me to focus a little bit more because there was some exposition, though I don't think it was overwhelming how it was being like delivered to us. There were some things that were like family lines and things like that that I needed to pay attention to, but things started really picking up right towards the end of this part. There is a ceremonial and the main character Juan is a medium, and so he was summoning the darkness. There were some kind of body horror gross moments that were happening, and it sort of is propelling the book into a faster paced novel, at least so far. There are many beautiful quotes. I'm underlining a lot of different little sections of things that I really like, and also just moments that I think are key to the plot. There's also a really interesting dynamic between our main character and his son Gaspar. Juan obviously loves his son and is doing everything he can to protect him, but he also has these rages against his son. So he will act violently towards his son, but then he'll say, "Don't be weak, nothing happened." And then after time goes by, the son says, "I'm sorry, do you forgive me?" Which is backwards from what should be happening. So there is an interesting dynamic there. I'm curious to see how that's going to progress because I don't really know what their early relationship was. It kind of sounds to me like his wife, who has passed away, was mostly responsible for his care. And she knows a lot more about like what he normally did during ceremonials, and she was more like entertaining him during different things. Like, it seems like he really just doesn't know all of what to do for his son. So there's this sort of interesting dynamic that I'm kind of mentally keeping a hold of to see how it progresses through the narrative. There are also so many things we don't know about the order and what that means, why they're summoning the darkness, how that is all happening, where his wife Rosario is now that she has passed on to the darkness or the other place, or there's many different names for it. And there are multiple places where dead go after they've died. So it's a really complex but not overly hard to understand situation. It's just something that, like I said, I need to be like actively paying attention to so that I don't miss anything. But I've really been liking doing the audiobook and physical book at the same time type of thing. That seems to be working really well, so I'm going to continue with that. Those are my thoughts as of page 138. So I'm going to continue reading, and I will update you again when I have more to say. Okay, we are back, and I have completed Our Share of Night by Mariana Enriquez. To be honest, it took me about a week to read this. It was quite dense and very long. It's like 600 pages, so it did take me a while to get through this, but I have completed it now, so I would like to go over my thoughts about the book, and then we can look at what Goodreads has to say and see if that aligns with what I think. So the first thing I will say about this is that it is quite long, and that is something that is very intimidating for me to start, and it continued to feel quite long throughout the book. I don't necessarily think that it should have been condensed or that it needed condensing. However, it just felt like it kind of went on and on as I was reading it, and it definitely did not feel like it went quickly. Like, I didn't fly through any section of this. It was a kind of slow and methodical process to really focus and get everything out of this book that I wanted to, and I'm not even sure that I did with one read. I do think this is a book that would benefit from subsequent rereads because it just is so dense. And I guess what I mean by that is There are a lot of characters, subplots. There are a lot of symbols and metaphors, and the language is very rich, which makes it feel quite dense when it's not super plot focused. It's more focused on commentary and this family dynamic. So it feels very dense and very long to read. However, it is absolutely beautifully written, and I do really love Enriquez's style in all of her works, and this definitely has her style coming through. However, it is a bit different than I expected. So having read all three of Enriquez's short story collections before this, I felt like her style had been cemented for me, and this does feel quite different. It does have a lot of similar elements and themes. However, it is inherently different because it is this epic novel over 600 pages. And when I'm reading short stories of hers, it's very contained and everything is happening within, 10, 20 pages. So it's succinct and there aren't all of these extra kind of subplots and sub themes and ideas happening. However, this one goes in so many different directions because it has the space to do so. So she explores topics that don't necessarily have to do directly with what is happening to the main characters. So in that way, it was a bit different than my expectations of her style. However, thematically, we still have the discussions of folklore in Argentina, the politics, militarization, and government control in Argentina. All of those things kind of come through, as well as the grotesque and supernatural elements that we see in her other work. But as I was reading this, I was kind of wondering where the explicit horror was going to be. And don't get me wrong, there are things in this book that are quite horrifying. However, when you kind of zoom out from those moments of horror, it feels more like an intergenerational family epic, family saga, more than it feels like a horror novel. In reality, this book is kind of genre defying because it feels like a literary family saga, but it also feels like fantasy, like a gothic horror book, like a supernatural story. And there are also many queer subplots throughout, which don't necessarily make up a genre, but it does feel just as much like a queer novel and a story about queer people as much as it is a horror novel. So all of these elements come together to create this epic saga that feels much more like an exploration of this family and toxic family dynamics and generational trauma and abuse, which you could argue is straight up horror itself, but the actual body horror elements are less prominent and more scattered throughout the book. I would say that the main source of horror in the story is child abuse and violence against children. So that is something that is in the forefront throughout the entire story. In that way, it reads like a horror novel to me, but it also reads like an exploration of a traumatic family dynamic and intergenerational trauma. So just from my kind of scattered explanation of what is happening in this book, you can see that there are all these different threads that are coming together to create it, and it's almost hard to gather all of them together to present to you. Also because basically anything I say about the plot of this book feels like a spoiler. There's not a lot of general things that I can say other than thematic elements. That's also why the description is very vague. It's just a young father and son set out on a road trip, and it talks a little bit about a terrifying legacy in the family, but that's kind of all that it says. So it is a hard book to describe without spoiling it. So how it was different from my expectation, I think I had just expected it to be so much more horror related as opposed to so much more of a family saga. I do think that the themes and topics that were discussed are really interesting, and I do appreciate the historical context of this book taking place during the military dictatorship in Argentina and all of the things that come through that. But with it being different than what I expected, I think that there is an inherent disappointment that comes with that for me. I had expected to absolutely love it and to be gripped from the first page to the last, even though it's a long book, because that's how I felt with Enriquez's other works. But I did not expect it to be so hard to digest and for it to take so long to process because it is so dense. I also just didn't expect to find sections of it a little bit slow, or not necessarily boring, but just harder to identify with the characters in those sections, or harder to get invested in what was happening. I think that just because it is such a long book, and because it does go on some tangents away from like our main characters, there are inherent sections that don't feel as connected to the rest of the story, and in those areas I was kind of like, is this necessary? I also struggled with the continual abusive relationship between Juan and his son Gaspar. These are our main two characters, and they are constantly in this violent situation, and it is just heartbreaking and the hardest part of this story to read. I still feel like I'm gathering my thoughts, even having taken a full day to process this. I don't know that I'm like succinctly bringing it together to tell you, but that is kind of where I'm at right now. I don't really know all of how to feel about this book. It is a behemoth and truly a huge undertaking, and honestly a very fascinating exploration of the occult and trauma in families, and Argentine politics and folklore and history. All of that came through very strongly in this book, and it is fascinating. However, I just felt a little bit disappointed, and I felt a little bit like I was struggling with it. So my rating, I think, of this book would be 4 stars. I think that feels right because there were so many things about this book that are lasting and that I highlighted and found really, really fascinating. And it does have a lot of Enriquez's signature style that I'm used to in her other books. However, it just didn't hit the way that I had hoped, and I think part of that is just because I don't digest big books as well as shorter books. I have a limited attention span. I find it hard to remember things from the beginning to the end, especially if it takes a week to read it. I also just think that big books feel intimidating, and I go into them feeling like it's going to be a harder read than a shorter book. And I'm not sure whether this was a harder read than her other books objectively, or if I've just convinced myself of that just because I went into it believing it would be harder. I don't know. I do feel like it is a more dense read than her other books, just purely because of the amount of pages and the sweeping nature of this story. So all of that to say, I gave this book 4 stars. So let's talk about whether Goodreads was right in the overall rating. So once again, the average rating for Our Share of Night on Goodreads is 4.26 with 57,000 ratings. And the breakdown of this looks like 51% 5-star ratings, 30% 4-star, 12% 3-star, 4% 2-star, and only 1% 1-star, which doesn't surprise me considering how beloved Enriquez is and how this book, I've heard, has been considered her magnum opus, her masterpiece. But yeah, over 50%, slightly over 50% rated this 5 stars. So that's kind of crazy. So obviously a lot of the reviews that I found when I was looking up reviews for this book are 5-star ratings. So a few that I want to point our attention to is this one by Brandy Lay. This person rated the book 5 stars, and their review says, "This is such a beautiful piece of literature. It has a great mix of grief, family issues, the supernatural, and LGBTQ plus representation. There were some parts that were quite chunky and overwritten, but it did not impact my overall love of the book." So that's really interesting to me because I would agree that there were parts that felt clunky or chunky and possibly overwritten. However, it did impact my overall love for the book, so I guess I'm just more affected by those things, but I do agree that it has great representation of LGBTQ plus characters and grief and family issues, so I do agree with most of this review. I did pull a 3-star review as well because there were some points that I wanted to talk about. So this person, Rachel, or The Shades of Orange, says that after loving this author's short story collection, I was eager to read this full-length novel by them. While this is classified as horror, I feel it read more like a sweeping family epic. Unfortunately, that is not my preferred genre. My biggest challenge with this book was the length. It's really, really long and felt exhaustive to get through. The writing is actually quite elegant, but it was just so long to get through. I liked pieces of the novel, particularly some of the cultural elements and family dynamics, but I didn't connect with the narrative as much as I had hoped. So this does highlight a couple of things that I did talk about, so I won't rehash that, but the idea that I didn't connect with it as much as I hoped, totally relate to that. I also do agree that it felt more like a sweeping family epic, and that is not my preferred genre either. So yeah, this did diminish my enjoyment of the book a little bit, but not as much as this person. Okay, so moving into some 4-star reviews. This review is by Plant-Based Bride, who is a YouTuber that I really like. And she talks at length about her experience with reading this. It talks about the explicit child abuse and how difficult that was to read. She does say that this was one of the most intriguing horror novels she's ever read, from commentary on Argentinian history, specifically the Dirty War and the Disappeared, classism, the dehumanization of the poor, the complexities of family relationships and generational trauma, and how Enriquez ties all of these things together with a cult of darkness. Her criticisms of the book kind of fall into a couple of categories. One is the writing, which felt a little bit clunky and bloated, possibly as a result of translation. And she says that there were some forays into non-essential characters that distracted from the primary narrative. So obviously a lot of the ratings and reviews on Goodreads are 5-star reviews, over 50%. So I am in the minority in that I rated it under 50%. However, I did still really like it, and some of the reviews that are kind of between 5 stars and 3 stars that give some criticisms and some positives, I kind of align with kind of a range of those things. My criticisms and the reasons that I gave this book 4 stars as opposed to 5 seem to be reflected in the reviews that are not 5-star, but even a couple of the 5-star reviews point out that there are sections that are clunky and feel a little bit too involved or go in too many different directions. It's just that I interpreted that as diminishing from my experience, whereas some people didn't. So I do feel like my experience is aligned with what the people of Goodreads seem to think. Okay, so I'd like to touch on my final thoughts on whether Goodreads is to be believed in terms of ratings. Reflecting on my experience, I do think that Goodreads has some level of credibility with the general overall rating of these books. Now, that's not to say that I haven't had many experiences where a book was really highly rated and I hated it, or a book was very low rated and I loved it. I think that ultimately it comes down to your personal taste in books, and I wouldn't necessarily let the Goodreads average rating situation dissuade you from reading a book or convince you to read a book that you're not interested in. That being said, I don't think that the average rating on Goodreads is the end-all be-all of what you should be looking at on Goodreads. I think in reality, the reviews that people write and the criticisms that people write out are more useful than just a star rating system, because we all know that Goodreads star rating system is inherently flawed in that it gives you 5 options, and a lot of people feel like a book is, 4.5 or 3.5 or 3.25 or those kind of more in between situations. And if you're forced to rate a book by a whole star, a lot of people round up. So the ratings could be a bit inflated because of that. So usually when I'm looking at Goodreads to see if a book has been rated well, I skim kind of what the average rating is, and then I look to people's reviews. And if people have consistent comments about things that they liked and didn't like, that to me feels a little bit more credible, because these are real people who are explaining what they liked and didn't like, and a lot of times have very valid and well thought out criticisms, and that to me is much more helpful than an average rating. So yes, Goodreads was right in that Aquarium was very hard for me to read and I had to DNF it, so it was lower rated, and Our Share of Night, which I really liked, was higher rated. So in that way, yes, Goodreads was right, but I think that it is important to take all of this with a grain of salt and know that Goodreads is not the definitive source of whether a book is good. It really all just comes down to your experience with the book and whether or not you liked it. If you enjoyed the video, feel free to like and subscribe, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.